The richest people usually hear the warning last. Rain crawled down the glass walls of Whitmore Tower like silver veins as Ethan Whitmore sat alone beneath the warm amber lights of Lawrence Steakhouse on West 52nd Street. Outside, Manhattan moved in restless rivers of headlights and umbrellas, but inside the restaurant, everything felt strangely muted, as if the city itself had lowered its voice around him. A jazz piano drifted softly through the room. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath hanging chandeliers. Waiters floated between tables in pressed black uniforms like ghosts trained to smile. And at the center of it all sat one of the most powerful men in America, alone on his birthday. Ethan loosened his tie slightly and stared at the untouched candle beside his 12-ounce ribeye. 42 years old. Billionaire. CEO of Whitmore Capital. Forbes covers. Political connections. Private jets. 3 homes. 2 bodyguards outside. And not a single person sitting across from him. His phone rested beside the plate. Silent. No family text. No friends. No assistant reminding him about tomorrow's meetings. Just silence wrapped in luxury. He picked up his bourbon slowly. The ice clinked against the glass. Across the restaurant, laughter erupted from a crowded anniversary table. Someone kissed someone. Someone raised a champagne toast. Ethan looked away almost immediately. He had spent 20 years building an empire large enough to buy entire buildings in Manhattan. Yet somehow he had built it so high that nobody could climb up there with him anymore. Medium rare ribeye for Mr. Whitmore. The voice was calm, warm, controlled. Ethan glanced up briefly as a waitress placed the plate in front of him. She was black, maybe late 20s, wearing the same crisp uniform as everyone else. But unlike the others, she moved with unusual precision. No wasted motion. No nervous smile. Her name tag read Naomi. Ethan barely nodded. Thank you. But Naomi didn't step away. She adjusted the silverware beside his plate carefully, her eyes lowering for just a second toward the reflection in the polished window behind him. Then she leaned closer. Close enough that only he could hear her. Keep eating, she whispered softly. And don't look up. Ethan froze for half a heartbeat. The jazz music continued. Plates clinked. Nobody reacted. Naomi straightened immediately, her face returning to professional calm, as if she had never spoken at all. Then she walked away. Ethan stared at the steak in front of him, suddenly aware of his own breathing. He almost turned instinctively, but something in her tone stopped him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was certainty. The kind of certainty people only speak with when they already know something terrible. He lifted his knife slowly, pretending nothing had changed. In the dark reflection of the restaurant window, he could barely make out shapes behind him. 3 men near the bar. Gray suits. 1 seated. 2 standing. None of them eating. Ethan's fingers tightened around the knife handle. He forced himself to cut into the steak. Medium rare. Perfectly cooked. Completely tasteless now. One of the men checked his watch. Another adjusted his jacket slightly. Ethan felt a cold weight settle low in his stomach. He'd seen this kind of stillness before. Boardrooms before hostile takeovers. Courtrooms before verdicts. Men preparing for something. Naomi reappeared near another table carrying drinks, but her eyes flickered toward him for the briefest second. Not emotional. Calculating. Watching. Ethan finally realized she wasn't nervous for herself. She was nervous for him. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan. Inside Lawrence, the piano player shifted into a slower melody. A birthday candle continued burning quietly beside Ethan's untouched plate, while somewhere behind him, one of the gray-suited men began walking in his direction. The man in the gray suit moved slowly enough to avoid attention, but not slowly enough to escape Naomi's eyes. She stood beside the service station polishing silverware with controlled hands while watching his reflection in the mirrored liquor shelves behind the bar. Every few seconds, he glanced toward Ethan's table. Not like a fan recognizing a celebrity. Not like a businessman spotting opportunity. This was different. Cold. Focused. Intentional. Ethan continued cutting into his steak even though he could no longer taste it. The bourbon burned slightly stronger, now going down his throat. Across the dining room, couples laughed beneath candlelight, completely unaware of the tension tightening quietly through the air like invisible wire. He kept his eyes low, pretending calm, but his mind had already begun calculating possibilities. Corporate enemies. Political enemies. Investors. Former partners. He had plenty of people who hated him. Billionaires did not become billionaires by making everyone comfortable. The footsteps behind him stopped. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A presence near his table. Mr. Whitmore. The voice was smooth and polite. Ethan looked up carefully. The gray-suited man offered a professional smile that never reached his eyes. Mid-40s. Athletic build. Clean haircut. Expensive watch. The kind of man trained to blend into wealthy rooms without ever being remembered afterward. Big admirer of your work, the man said. Mind if I congratulate you personally? Ethan forced a faint smile. Depends how long the speech is. The man chuckled softly, but his eyes did not move. Fair enough. Naomi appeared almost instantly beside the table carrying a tray with another glass of bourbon Ethan had not ordered. Compliments of the house, sir, she said smoothly, placing it down between them. But as she set the glass onto the tablecloth, her fingers tapped twice against the wood beside Ethan's plate. 2 quick taps. Sharp. Deliberate. Warning. Ethan noticed immediately. So did the man in gray. For one brief second, the atmosphere shifted. Naomi smiled politely toward the stranger. Sir, your table is ready near the lounge if you would like more privacy. The man stared at her. Not annoyed. Studying her. I am fine here, he replied. Naomi nodded once. Of course. Then she looked at Ethan directly for the first time since the whisper. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a message loud enough to cut through the music. Do not trust him. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. You said you admired my work, he said casually. Which part? The man smiled again. The restructuring last month took courage. Ethan's stomach tightened almost invisibly. Only a handful of insiders knew how ugly that restructuring had truly become. 3 executives removed. Millions uncovered in hidden accounts. Careers destroyed overnight. One man in particular had threatened Ethan directly after the board vote. Victor Lang, former chief operations officer. Brilliant. Ruthless. Humiliated publicly. Ethan suddenly remembered Victor's final words before security escorted him out of Whitmore Tower. You think money protects you because everyone bows when you walk into a room, Victor had said quietly. One day you are going to realize fear and respect are not the same thing. The gray-suited man adjusted his cuff slowly. You made powerful enemies lately, Mr. Whitmore. Ethan kept his expression neutral. That usually means I made the right decision. The stranger smiled faintly. Sometimes. Near the kitchen entrance, Naomi picked up a tray, but Ethan noticed she had stopped pretending now. Her eyes tracked every movement in the room. One of the other gray-suited men near the bar touched his earpiece briefly. The third man shifted positions closer to the front entrance. Coordinated. Ethan finally understood. This was not coincidence. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller. Tighter. The jazz piano continued playing softly while candlelight flickered against polished wine glasses, but underneath the luxury, something dangerous had entered the room and quietly locked the exits. Naomi began walking toward Ethan again, her pace measured and steady. Then every light inside Lawrence flickered once. Just once. A tiny interruption. Most customers barely noticed. But Naomi did. Her eyes widened for half a second before she looked directly at Ethan and said firmly, Sir, whatever happens next, do not stand up. People who spend their lives in control rarely recognize the exact moment control leaves them. Ethan kept his hands steady on the table even as his pulse began climbing beneath the calm surface he had trained himself to wear in boardrooms and negotiations. Naomi's warning echoed in his mind while the restaurant lights settled back to normal. Around them, nobody reacted. A woman near the window laughed over a glass of wine. A waiter carried lobster tails toward a corner booth. The piano player continued gliding through soft jazz notes as though the night had not quietly shifted into something dangerous. But Ethan saw it now. The patterns, the positions, the timing. The 3 gray-suited men were no longer pretending to be strangers. One stood near the front entrance with a clear line of sight toward the dining room. Another remained by the bar pretending to check messages on his phone. The third still lingered near Ethan's table, smiling too calmly for a random admirer. Naomi moved toward the service station again, but Ethan noticed something else now. She never turned her back completely to the room. Every movement she made allowed her to keep eyes on all 3 men at once. That was not instinct from restaurant work. That came from experience. You seem tense, Mr. Whitmore, the man beside him said lightly. Ethan picked up his bourbon. You seem interested in my evening. The man smiled faintly. Important people attract attention. Ethan held the glass near his lips without drinking. And what exactly makes tonight important? The stranger looked toward the candle beside Ethan's plate. A birthday can make people reflective. Ethan stared at him carefully now. Or vulnerable. For the first time, the man's smile faded slightly. Naomi suddenly approached with another tray, this time carrying a small chocolate dessert topped with a single candle. Compliments from the manager, she said. Her voice remained perfectly professional, but when she set the plate down, she slid a folded linen napkin beside Ethan's hand. Small, fast, hidden beneath the edge of the dessert plate. Ethan barely moved. Naomi walked away before anyone noticed. The gray-suited man glanced briefly toward the dessert. Looks like they care about you here. Ethan forced a small smile. Apparently more than most people. The stranger studied him for another second before stepping away at last. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Whitmore. Then he walked calmly toward the bar. Ethan waited until the man turned his back before unfolding the napkin beneath the table. 3 words written, quickly in black ink. They cut power. Ethan's chest tightened. He looked instinctively toward the ceiling lights. Backup systems. Emergency protocols. Security cameras. If the building lost power even briefly, confusion alone would create opportunity. Outside the windows, rain slammed harder against Manhattan streets. Thunder rolled low between skyscrapers. Ethan looked toward the restaurant entrance. His 2 bodyguards should have been visible through the glass. They were gone. For the first time that night, real fear touched him. Not panic. Something colder. The realization that whatever was happening had already moved beyond coincidence. Naomi appeared near the kitchen doorway, speaking quietly into the restaurant phone. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan again. Urgent now. Then the hostess hurried across the dining room toward the manager with visible confusion on her face. Something was wrong. Ethan slipped the napkin into his jacket pocket just as his phone vibrated against the table. Unknown number. He answered carefully. Whitmore. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a familiar voice spoke softly through static. Victor Lang. Happy birthday, Ethan. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Where are my security men? Victor laughed quietly. Tonight is not about security. Tonight is about perspective. Ethan lowered his voice. What do you want? I want you to finally understand what it feels like to sit in a room full of money and realize none of it can save you. The line disconnected. Ethan stared at the dark phone screen while the jazz music continued floating through Lawrence like nothing had changed. Then every light inside the restaurant suddenly dimmed again, longer this time, and somewhere near the kitchen Naomi whispered under her breath, Not yet. Please not yet. Naomi Brooks learned a long time ago that danger almost never arrived screaming. It arrived smiling. The lights stabilized again, but the brief flicker had already changed the room. Staff members began exchanging uncertain glances near the kitchen. The hostess checked the reservation tablet twice in confusion. One waiter quietly muttered that the security system had disconnected for a few seconds. Most customers ignored it completely. Wealthy restaurants in Manhattan survived on illusion. People paid hundreds of dollars to believe bad things happened somewhere else. But Naomi knew better. She stood near the espresso station, gripping a coffee pot she had forgotten to refill, her eyes locked on the reflection in the dark wine cabinet across the room. The 3 men in gray had shifted positions again. Closer now. More deliberate. She could almost feel the countdown moving beneath the surface of the restaurant. Ethan remained seated at table 14, but his posture had changed. Earlier, he looked like a man exhausted by success. Now he looked alert, focused, cornered. He had finally stopped acting like the richest man in the room and started acting like prey. Naomi moved toward the manager's office quickly. Ron, the security feed is down again, she said quietly. The manager barely looked up from his tablet. Building maintenance already reset it. You need to call the police. That got his attention. What? Naomi lowered her voice. Something is wrong tonight. Ron frowned immediately. Naomi, this is a 5-star restaurant. We cannot panic guests because the lights blinked. She glanced toward Ethan's table. I am serious. Ron followed her eyes toward the billionaire CEO sitting beneath candlelight. This is about him. Naomi hesitated for half a second. I think those men are waiting for something. Ron sighed under his breath, already irritated. You watch too many crime documentaries. Then he straightened his tie and walked back toward the dining room. choosing comfort over caution the way most people did. Naomi remained frozen in the hallway for one brief moment. She had seen this before. Not the expensive suits, not the luxury restaurant, but the feeling, the silence before people realized they were standing too close to danger. 15 years earlier, her father owned a small late-night diner on the south side of Chicago. Nothing fancy. Red booths, burnt coffee, pancakes served 24 hours a day. Naomi used to do homework behind the counter while her father joked with truck drivers and night shift nurses. Then one winter night, two angry men walked into the diner arguing quietly. Everyone ignored them at first. People always ignored tension when it entered politely. 10 minutes later, the entire room changed forever. Naomi blinked hard, forcing the memory away. She returned to the dining room carrying a tray she did not need, keeping her movements natural. Calm. Invisible. Ethan noticed her immediately. "You called someone?" he asked quietly as she passed beside him. "Manager thinks I am overreacting." Ethan gave a humorless smile. "That has been my board's opinion of me for years." Naomi almost smiled back, but her attention shifted toward the entrance. Another man had entered the restaurant. Not gray suit. Black coat. Baseball cap pulled low. He did not approach a table. He simply stood near the front windows pretending to scroll through his phone while rainwater dripped from his sleeves onto the marble floor. Naomi's chest tightened. For now. Ethan followed her gaze carefully without moving his head. "Friend of theirs?" he murmured. Naomi nodded once. "Your security team should be inside by now." Ethan reached slowly for his phone again. No signal. Just one empty bar flashing weakly in the corner. "That should not happen in Midtown Manhattan," he said quietly. Naomi looked toward the ceiling cameras. Dead. Every single one. The jazz piano stopped suddenly in the middle of a song. The pianist frowned down at the keys before tapping them again. Silence. Then the entire restaurant went dark for 3 full seconds. Gasps scattered through the room. Glasses clinked. Somewhere near the kitchen, a woman let out a nervous laugh. Emergency lights finally flickered on, bathing Lawrence Steakhouse in dim amber shadows instead of warm gold. And in that strange half-light, Naomi saw all 4 men move at the exact same time. Darkness changes people faster than fear does. The moment the emergency lights flickered on, Lawrence Steakhouse stopped feeling elegant and started feeling exposed. The soft gold atmosphere disappeared beneath dim amber shadows that stretched long across white tablecloths and polished marble floors. Conversations faded into nervous murmurs. A woman near the back asked why the music stopped. Someone laughed awkwardly. Someone else reached for a phone that no longer had service. And through all of it, Naomi watched the 4 men move with terrifying calm. They were not panicking like the guests. They were adjusting. The man near the entrance locked the front doors with one smooth motion, disguised as fixing his coat sleeve. Another shifted toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. The man at the bar scanned the dining room slowly, searching for Ethan beneath the emergency lights. They had rehearsed this. Ethan pushed his chair back slightly. "Tell me exactly what they want," he said quietly as Naomi approached his table again, carrying an empty tray to avoid attention. "I do not think they came to rob the restaurant," she replied under her breath. "Then why keep everyone inside?" Naomi looked directly at him. "Because you are the reason they are here." Ethan's jaw tightened. Across the room, Ron the manager finally sensed something wrong. He approached the entrance quickly, fumbling for his keys. "Sir, the doors should remain unlocked during business hours," he said nervously to the man standing there. The man smiled politely. "Temporary electrical issue. Safer this way." Ron forced an uncertain laugh. "I still need to reopen them." The stranger stepped closer without raising his voice. "No, you do not." Ron stopped immediately. Something inside that quiet answer drained the color from his face. Naomi turned back toward Ethan. "We do not have much time." Ethan glanced around the room carefully. "My security team is gone. My phone is dead. And somehow you are the calmest person here." Naomi lowered her voice even further. "Because panic gets people noticed." Then she looked toward the kitchen hallway. "Can you move fast?" Ethan almost laughed at the question. "I am 42 years old, and I spend most of my life in meetings." That is not an answer. Before Ethan could respond, the restaurant speakers crackled overhead with a burst of static. Every head in the dining room lifted instinctively. Then silence returned. One of the gray-suited men touched his earpiece and nodded once toward the others. Naomi's eyes sharpened immediately. They are about to move. Ethan looked at her carefully now, finally realizing something important. She was not guessing anymore. She knew how to read people under pressure because she had lived through situations where reading people correctly meant survival. Naomi suddenly grabbed a wine bottle from a nearby service cart and intentionally slammed it against the edge of another tray. Glass exploded across the marble floor with a deafening crash. The entire restaurant jumped. Guests gasped. Several people stood up at once. Ron shouted in frustration. Every pair of eyes turned toward Naomi, including the four men. "I am so sorry," Naomi yelled loudly, dropping to her knees as if flustered by the accident. "Everybody please stay seated." In the confusion, she looked directly at Ethan and mouthed two words. "Now." Ethan reacted instantly. For the first time all night, the billionaire CEO stopped thinking like an executive and trusted someone else completely. He stood and moved quickly toward the kitchen hallway while guests remained distracted by the shattered glass and spilled wine spreading across the floor. Naomi rose immediately and intercepted one of the gray-suited men trying to move after Ethan. "Sir, watch your step," she said firmly, blocking his path with the overturned tray. The man's expression hardened for the first time. Not anger, annoyance, like a plan falling slightly out of rhythm. Ethan disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors just as one of the emergency lights overhead flickered again. Naomi followed seconds later, her heart pounding against her ribs. Behind them, voices rose louder inside the restaurant. Confused guests, nervous staff, chairs scraping across marble. But deeper beneath the noise came something far worse. Calm footsteps following them into the kitchen. The kitchen behind Lawrence Steakhouse felt like another world entirely. Gone were the chandeliers, the polished marble, the expensive perfume drifting through the dining room. Back here, everything was steel, steam, heat, and noise. Industrial lights buzzed overhead. Dishwashers roared like engines. Pans hissed across open flames while cooks shouted half-finished orders that nobody seemed to hear anymore. But beneath the chaos, fear was spreading fast. Staff members clustered near prep stations whispering nervously after the blackout. One-line cook kept checking his phone even though there was still no signal. Another employee tried the back exit twice before realizing the electronic lock had failed shut. Ethan followed Naomi quickly through the narrow corridor between storage shelves, his expensive dress, shoes slipping slightly against the damp kitchen floor. "This place is a maze," he muttered under his breath. "That is the point," Naomi replied without slowing down. "Customers are supposed to feel calm, while chaos stays hidden back here." Ethan glanced at her carefully. "You sound like you know something about hiding chaos." Naomi stopped briefly beside a stainless steel prep table and looked toward the swinging doors leading back into the dining room. The shadows of moving figures crossed beneath the narrow gap at the bottom, following them. "I grew up around people who smiled before bad things happened," she said quietly. "You learn to notice patterns." Ethan watched her for a moment. Until tonight, nobody had probably asked this woman a real question in months. Maybe years. Men like him walked past people like her every day without ever wondering what made them sharp enough to survive. Naomi grabbed a white kitchen apron hanging nearby and handed it to him. "Put this on." Ethan stared at it. "You cannot be serious. Right now you look exactly like a billionaire hiding in a restaurant kitchen." Ethan hesitated for half a second before tying the apron around his suit jacket. Naomi almost smiled despite the tension. "Congratulations. You finally look like someone who works for a living." Ethan gave a dry laugh under his breath. Strange timing for humor, but somehow it cut through the fear just enough to keep him moving. Somewhere behind them, a loud voice echoed from the dining room. Calm. Controlled. One of the gray-suited men was speaking to the guests now. "Please remain seated while the electrical issue is handled." Naomi's expression hardened immediately. "They're trying to keep everyone calm until they find you." Ethan leaned closer. Victor would not risk this many witnesses unless he was desperate. "Or angry," Naomi replied. She pushed through another swinging door leading deeper into the service hallway where the noise of the kitchen faded into a low mechanical hum. Freezers lined the walls. Storage racks towered overhead stacked with boxes and supplies. The air turned colder instantly. Ethan loosened the apron slightly. "You still have not answered my question." Naomi looked back at him. "What question?" Why are you helping me? The hallway fell quiet except for the distant rumble of thunder outside and the muffled kitchen noise behind them. Naomi crossed her arms slowly. Because nobody helped my father. Ethan said nothing. Naomi stared toward the freezer doors as memories pressed against her voice. He owned a diner in Chicago. Small place. Nothing fancy. One night some men came in angry at each other. Everybody noticed. Nobody acted. Her jaw tightened slightly. People kept eating. Pretending not to see. Pretending danger belongs to somebody else until it reaches their table. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Naomi continued quietly. My father tried calming things down. 10 minutes later, my entire life changed. The cold air hummed softly around them. Ethan suddenly understood why Naomi had recognized the signs tonight before anyone else. She was not reacting from fear. She was reacting from memory. I am sorry, he said quietly. Naomi gave a small shrug like apologies had expired years ago. I decided a long time ago I would never stand there again and watch someone walk into danger if I could stop it. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not as a waitress. Not as background. But as the only person in the building who had stayed calm enough to save him. Then footsteps echoed faintly from the other end of the hallway. Slow. Measured. Getting closer. Naomi's eyes snapped toward the sound immediately. They found the service corridor. Ethan instinctively straightened. What do we do now? Naomi looked toward a large freezer door beside them, then back toward the approaching footsteps growing louder against the concrete floor. Now, she whispered, you stop being the man who owns the room and start listening to the woman who knows how to survive one. Sometimes survival begins the moment pride finally shuts up. Naomi grabbed Ethan's wrist and pulled him toward the industrial freezer door just as the footsteps echoed closer through the corridor. The cold metal handle screeched softly when she yanked it open. Freezing air rolled outward immediately, wrapping around them like winter exploding into the hallway. Inside, shelves of boxed seafood, steaks, and frozen vegetables towered beneath dim fluorescent lights. Naomi pushed Ethan inside first. Move. Ethan stepped carefully between metal racks while his breath fogged instantly in front of him. This is your plan? He whispered. Do you have a better one? She replied, shutting the heavy door almost completely, but leaving a thin gap open toward the hallway. The footsteps stopped outside. Ethan froze beside the shelves while Naomi remained near the crack in the freezer door, watching silently. Two men passed through the corridor. Gray suits. Calm voices. One of them spoke quietly into an earpiece. Kitchen checked. Service rooms clear. Another voice answered through static. He is still inside somewhere. Ethan looked at Naomi in disbelief. They were hunting him through a five-star restaurant like professionals tracking a target. The billionaire who controlled entire markets suddenly found himself hiding behind frozen salmon while a waitress protected him with instinct alone. The men outside continued walking. Their footsteps slowly faded deeper into the building. Naomi finally exhaled. We have maybe 5 minutes. Ethan rubbed his hands together against the cold. 5 minutes until what? Until they realize you are smarter than most rich men and stopped hiding in obvious places. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. That sounds dangerously close to a compliment. Naomi leaned against the freezer wall, shivering slightly now that adrenaline was wearing off. Do not get used to it. Silence settled between them for a moment. The freezer hummed softly overhead, while distant kitchen noise echoed faintly through the metal walls. Ethan studied her carefully. She looked exhausted. Now, not weak. Human. The kind of tired people carried after years of surviving things nobody applauded them for. You should not be risking yourself for me, he said quietly. Naomi gave a small humorless laugh. You still think this is about you? Ethan frowned slightly. Naomi looked down at the frozen floor. Tonight is about what kind of person I become if I stand there and do nothing again. Ethan watched her closely. You blame yourself for your father. Naomi's jaw tightened. I blame everyone. Her voice stayed calm, but something deeper moved underneath it now. Customers kept eating while things got worse. Staff pretended not to notice. Everybody waited for somebody else to act. She looked directly at Ethan. People always think danger announces itself loudly. Most of the time it whispers first. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. For years he had built his reputation on control, efficiency, power. Yet none of those things were protecting him now. Naomi was. A woman whose name he would have forgotten 5 minutes after dinner on any other night. Victor used to say, I only noticed people when they became useful, Ethan admitted quietly. Naomi crossed her arms. Was he wrong? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Somewhere along the way, he had learned how to evaluate value instead of humanity. Employees, investors, partners, even family sometimes. Everything became performance metrics and outcomes. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Naomi suddenly looked toward the freezer door again. Wait. Ethan heard it too now. Not footsteps this time. Voices. Loud voices. Coming from the dining room direction. Panicked. Confused. Then one sentence cut clearly through the noise. There is a fire near the kitchen. Naomi's eyes widened instantly. That is not real. Ethan straightened immediately. They are flushing people out. Naomi nodded. If guests panic and evacuate, they can isolate you easier. Another announcement echoed faintly through the corridor outside. Everyone please remain calm and proceed toward the main entrance. Naomi cursed quietly under her breath. They are controlling the exits. Ethan stared at her. Then what do we do? Naomi looked toward the freezer shelves, thinking fast. Then her eyes landed on a stack of employee delivery jackets hanging near the back wall. Her expression changed instantly. We stop hiding. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Naomi grabbed one of the jackets and tossed it toward him. It means rich men survive situations like this by paying people. Tonight you survive by becoming invisible. Then, for the first time all night, a loud metallic bang slammed somewhere just outside the freezer door. The sound outside the freezer door echoed through the narrow corridor like a warning shot from fate itself. Ethan instinctively stepped backward while Naomi grabbed his arm before panic could make him do something reckless. Listen to me carefully, she whispered. The moment we walk out there, you stop acting rich. Ethan stared at her. I do not know how to do that. Naomi pulled one of the delivery jackets tighter around his shoulders and zipped it halfway over his dress shirt. Tonight would be a very good night to learn. Another metallic bang rattled somewhere outside, followed by hurried footsteps and raised voices from the kitchen. The fake fire alarm was working. Staff members were evacuating supplies. Guests were being pushed toward controlled exits. Chaos was spreading exactly the way Victor Lang wanted. Naomi cracked open the freezer door slightly and checked the hallway. Empty for now. Stay close to me, she said. Do not talk unless I tell you. Ethan nodded once. Strange. 42 years old. Worth billions of dollars. And suddenly taking instructions from a waitress young enough to be his employee. Yet nothing about tonight made sense anymore except one truth. Naomi had been right every single time. They slipped into the hallway carefully. The cold service corridor had become louder now. Kitchen staff rushed past carrying boxes and shouting over each other. Smoke was beginning to drift faintly through the ventilation system even though no actual fire existed. Someone had triggered emergency procedures intentionally. Naomi moved fast through the confusion, carrying an empty produce crate, while Ethan followed beside her with his head lowered. Beneath a black employee cap she had found hanging near the freezer. Nobody looked twice at them. Invisible. Just workers during a crisis. Ethan almost could not believe it. 5 minutes earlier, he had been the most recognizable man in the building. Now dozens of people walked past him without a second glance. Naomi leaned closer while they crossed behind the dessert station. Power works until the lights go out, she murmured quietly. Ethan looked at her. What? Rich people spend their whole lives trying to be seen. She pushed through another swinging door. Working people survive by disappearing. They entered a narrow loading corridor behind the kitchen where stacks of food deliveries lined the walls. Rain hammered loudly against the back exit door nearby. Freedom was maybe 20 feet away. Then Ethan froze. One of the gray-suited men stood near the loading dock speaking into a phone. No sign of him near the main dining room, the man said calmly. Check the employee exits. Naomi reacted instantly. She grabbed Ethan's wrist and pulled him behind a rolling rack loaded with clean tablecloths. Their breathing tightened in the darkness between steel shelves while the man's footsteps moved closer. Ethan could hear his own pulse now. Not because he feared losing money. Not because of scandal or reputation. For the first time in years, he was afraid in the oldest human way possible. Vulnerable. Mortal. Naomi stayed perfectly still beside him. Her eyes remained focused. Calculating exits. Distances. Timing. Ethan suddenly understood something terrifying. She had probably spent her whole life preparing for moments rich people assumed would never happen to them. The gray-suited man paused only a few feet away. "Loading dock secure," he said into the phone. "If Whitmore is still inside, he is running out of places to hide." Ethan's jaw tightened. Naomi slowly reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone. No signal bars. But she opened the voice memo app quietly and pressed record anyway. Ethan looked confused. Naomi mouthed silently. "Evidence." The man outside continued speaking. "Victor wants this handled before police arrive. Too many witnesses. Already." Ethan's eyes sharpened immediately. There it was. Confirmation. Not paranoia. Not coincidence. Victor Lang was behind everything. Naomi kept recording silently while rain thundered against the metal loading door. Then another voice crackled through the man's earpiece. "We found Whitmore's security detail outside. They are locked in the garage maintenance room." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Victor had planned everything. The timing. The blackout. The isolation. The exits. Naomi ended the recording carefully and slipped the phone back into her pocket. "That changes things," she whispered once the footsteps moved away again. Ethan looked at her. "How?" Naomi stared toward the loading dock exit where rainwater streamed beneath the door. "Because now we do not just survive tonight." Her expression hardened with quiet determination. "Now we expose them." Just then, red and blue emergency lights flashed faintly through the rain outside the loading dock windows, and for the first time all night, the men hunting Ethan Whitmore were no longer the only ones closing in. The rain outside Manhattan felt different once the truth finally had witnesses. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the loading dock windows, while voices shouted beyond the metal doors. Police officers. Fire crews. Real authority entering a night built entirely on controlled fear. Naomi tightened her grip on the produce crate beside her while Ethan slowly removed the black employee cap from his head. For the first time in hours, he looked like himself again, but something in his face had changed. The arrogance was gone. The cold executive mask had cracked somewhere between the freezer and the loading corridor. One of the gray-suited men suddenly appeared near the far end of the hallway, stopping instantly when he spotted Ethan. His calm expression disappeared for the first time all night. Naomi stepped forward before Ethan could react. "Police are outside," she said firmly. "This ends tonight." The man glanced toward the loading dock doors where flashing lights reflected across the wet concrete floor. Then he reached slowly toward his earpiece, but Ethan spoke first. "Victor sent you. Because he thought fear would bring me back under control." His voice stayed calm now. "Different. Tell him he finally taught me something useful." The man stared at him silently before turning and disappearing back through the corridor without another word. Naomi exhaled slowly. "They are leaving." Ethan shook his head. "No, they are surviving." Sirens echoed louder outside. The loading dock doors suddenly burst open as police officers rushed in shouting commands through the storm. Behind them came two exhausted members of Ethan's security team, still wearing loosened zip ties around their wrists after escaping the locked maintenance room. "Mr. Whitmore," one of them shouted in disbelief. Ethan raised a hand calmly. "It is over." But even as officers spread through the restaurant securing guests and staff, Ethan barely noticed the chaos anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi. She looked exhausted beneath the harsh emergency lights. Her apron stained from kitchen grease, hair slightly undone, hands trembling now that survival no longer required strength every second. She had spent the entire night protecting a man who probably would not have remembered her name 24 hours earlier. One officer approached Naomi gently. "Ma'am, we are going to need statements from everyone." Naomi nodded quietly. Then she reached into her apron pocket and handed over her phone. "I recorded this." Ethan watched the officer's expression change while listening to Victor Lang's voice through the recording. Confirmation. Names. Intent. Enough to destroy careers, investigations, reputations. Enough to expose the truth. The officer looked back at Naomi with visible respect. "This may have saved a lot of people tonight." Naomi shrugged softly. "I just noticed what everybody else ignored." Those words stayed with Ethan long after the police escorted guests safely from Lawrence Steakhouse and reporters began crowding behind barricades outside. They stayed with him through the investigation that followed, through Victor Lang's arrest, through the headlines calling it an attempted corporate retaliation scandal, through every television interview where journalists kept asking Ethan how he survived, because the truth embarrassed him. He survived because a woman's society trained itself not to notice decided his life still mattered. 3 months later, Manhattan stood bright beneath clear autumn skies as Ethan Whitmore entered Lawrence Steakhouse again. The restaurant had reopened after renovations. New lighting, new security systems. Same table near the windows. Table 14. But tonight he was not alone. Reporters waited outside. Cameras flashed through the glass. Employees stood nervously near the entrance expecting another billionaire publicity moment. Instead, Ethan walked directly toward Naomi Brooks. She had almost refused to come. Her black dress was simple, elegant, nothing expensive. She still looked uncomfortable around attention. Ethan understood that now too. Some people spend their whole lives surviving quietly because the world only notices them when it wants something. Ethan stepped beside her and handed her a small envelope. Naomi frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside rested ownership documents. Not for the restaurant. For a new foundation downtown. The Naomi Brooks Initiative. Scholarships for hospitality workers, emergency support for working families, and community safety training programs across Chicago and New York. Naomi stared at the papers in stunned silence. Ethan looked out across the restaurant softly. "For 20 years I thought power meant controlling rooms full of people." Then he looked back at her. "That night you taught me power is seeing people before it is too late." Naomi said nothing for a long moment. Her eyes lowered toward the candle flickering quietly on table 14. The same table where one lonely billionaire once sat believing money made him untouchable. Outside, Manhattan continued moving in rivers of light and ambition. Inside Lawrence Steakhouse, something far rarer had happened. A man with everything finally learned the value of a human being who had nothing to gain by saving him. And somewhere beneath the soft jazz and city lights, the truth settled quietly into the room like grace. The richest man there had not been Ethan Whitmore after